What's up, guys? We're going to be talking about functions. A function is a piece of code that does something. So an example would be a piece of code that takes in a variable, does something with that variable, and then returns or gives back a new variable. So let's see an example of how we write a function in JavaScript. So we'll type function. We'll follow that with the name of the function. This can be anything. So we'll call it my function. We then use brackets to indicate that it's a function. So we have a left and right bracket. We then make use of curly brackets where we're going to write out the logic of the function. Now we'll start with something very simple. We'll just console log out a string, and that string will be function executed. So we can see really simple function. All it does is console log out function executed. Now, if we run the script at the moment, it won't do anything because all we've done is defined a function, but we haven't actually used that function. So in order to use this function, we'll type out the function name along with a left and right bracket. We'll use the semicolon since that's what we've been doing to indicate the end of a line in JavaScript. So now we are defining the function, then we are proceeding to call the function. Let's execute this. We have the string function executed visible in the output. Now we mentioned that a function could take in variables and output other variables as a result. So let's write a function that takes in two numbers and then returns or gives back the sum of those two numbers. Now, when we defined the function, we had these brackets here, and inside the brackets, we can define any variables or parameters, as they are known, that the function takes in. So our first parameter we'll call num1 for number 1, and our second parameter we'll call num2. Inside the logic of the function, we can add these values. So we can say num1 plus num2. Now at the moment, this won't do anything. Let's try running this code. We get absolutely nothing. That's because all that's happened here is we've added two numbers, but we haven't printed that output to the screen. Now we could assign this to a variable. So let's declare a new variable and we'll call it my new num equals num1 plus num2. Then we'll console log the value of my new num. Then we can see finally we are calling that function, my function. And when we say calling a function in code, we mean that we're executing that function. Now this is not going to work just yet. In fact, let's try running our code. The problem here is that this function is now expecting parameters. It expects a parameter called num1, and it also expects a parameter called num2. So we need to put these inside the brackets here. So we need to give two numbers as parameters to the function. So let's set num1 to 5 and num2 to 10. Let's execute this function or call this function, and we get 15 as an output. And we can change the parameters. So let's try 15 and 10. It's now going to output 25. Now this is of course one way to give back information from a function, simply to console log. But in most cases, a function will give back data via a return statement. So a function takes in a value, it then returns a value. So instead of console log my new num, we can finish this function with return my new num. Now if we run that script, once again we're going to get 0 output. But if we were to console log the result of that function, because this function is returning the value, and that value is of course the two parameters added together, then that value will now be console log to the output, 25 in this case. So this type of code, where we define a function, that function takes in parameters, that function does something with the parameters, and then that function returns the final value. This is something that's used in pretty much all coding languages. So it's a technique that we want to be very familiar with. Just to give you a really quick idea, if we fire up our PHP file, one of the things that's interesting when we compare PHP and JavaScript is that the syntax is very similar. So we can say function, my function. We have the two brackets. We then have what we refer to as curly brackets. So we have regular brackets to indicate that it's a function. We then have curly brackets where the function logic goes. We want this function to take in parameters. One small difference here is that we need this $sign to indicate that these are variables. So we're going to take in num1, num2, and we can simply return the result of num1 plus num2. So notice we kind of skipped a step there. So with JavaScript, we actually set my new num to a certain result, the sum of these two numbers, then we returned it. But technically, we don't even need to declare a variable there. We can just say return num1 plus num2, and it will return the result of that expression. So we've actually simplified our code here. This still works, by the way. If we run this, we're still going to get 25 as the output here. So that's what we're doing here in PHP. Notice how similar these are in terms of the way that they are written. Now, of course, we still need to call a function. This won't do anything in PHP just yet because it's just a function. And we can call a function in a very similar way to how we'd call it in JavaScript. We need to, of course, pass in those parameters. So if we pass in 15 and 10 again. Now, once again, this is not going to do anything at this stage. It's calling the function, and the function's returning a value, but we're not printing the result of that function to the screen. So if we did echo my function 1510, then in PHP, that's going to print the result of that function to the screen because it's 25 here. So this is why we say once you've learned one coding language, it really opens up a fast learning process for many of the other coding languages. I mean, this is more or less the same syntax. Let's just put this side by side temporarily just so you can compare this. There are a few small differences. PHP has to start with this tag to indicate that it's PHP, but the way that the function is declared is completely the same. The only difference is we have these $signs in front of the variables, and instead of console log, we use echo, but we're pretty much writing very, very similar syntax here. Now, to show you a third example, let's have a look at Python and see how we'd write this kind of script in Python. So we'll use def to define a function. My function, I'm going to take in parameters. Like JavaScript, we don't actually need the $sign. Now, one of the things that's a little bit different with Python is it doesn't make use of those curly brackets. It actually makes use of indentation to indicate where the blocks of code are. So we end this line with a colon, and when we press enter, notice in fact that our code editor is automatically indenting our cursor. So rather than wrap everything in these curly braces, our code editor recognizes that this is a Python function. Anything that's indented is going to be part of the logic of that function. Once again, we can use return num1 plus num2. And that's it. We don't need to end the block of code. In fact, as soon as we remove that indentation, it implies that we are now outside the definition of that function. Python uses the print function to echo data to the screen, and we're going to print the result of my function. And let's give it some values, give it some slightly different values this time. Let's try 10 and 20. Let's run this code, and you can see we get 30 echoed to the screen. So again, it is different. You will have to spend some time learning the syntax, but notice this same technique is used across all three coding languages. We define a function, we explain which parameters that function should take in, we include function logic along with a return statement. We can then print the output of that function to the screen. And of course, when we call that function, we provide the parameters that it needs. It then returns a value based on those input parameters. Now, while we're on the topic of functions, we just return purely to our JavaScript. Notice how we call a function. We have the function name, and we have the brackets, and inside the brackets we include parameters, if any. Well, note that we've been making use of an inbuilt function all along, which is console log. This is a type of function We know that because it has these two brackets here. And console log takes in a parameter. It takes in the data that we want echoed to the screen. So we see two different types of functions. All coding languages have a wide array of built-in functions that we can make use of, but we can also create our own functions, which we can then make use of in any subsequent code. Okay, so just a couple of other things before we move on to the next topic. Firstly, note that we can set a default value for parameters that are not defined in the function call. So for example, in this JavaScript function, let's set the second parameter there with a default value. So I'll put num2 equals 20. Now note what happens when we just call the function with a single value. We now get the value 35 output to the screen. You can see here that when we called the function, we only included one parameter. So what happens in this case is that the function uses this fallback default value for the value of the second parameter. But what happens if we explicitly define the value of that second parameter? Let's run this code. We now get 16. So this default value for the second parameter is ignored because we've explicitly defined the second parameter. So we can use default values for any parameters that are not explicitly defined when the function is called. Also, when we looked at variables, we explained that a variable can actually store a function. So let's see what this looks like in JavaScript. So instead of function myFunction, we'll say const myFunction. So we're declaring a variable, a constant in this case. Then we'll put equals function. So what we've done here is assign this particular function to a variable myFunction. So when we call myFunction, in some ways this is just another way of writing the same thing. Pass in our two values. And of course, we'll console log that to the screen as well so we can see the result. And when we run that, we now see 30 console logged to the screen. So we can see that we've stored a function inside a variable in this case. Okay, so key takeaways from this session. A function is a block of code that does something, and that function is executed when it's called. We refer to it as calling a function. A function can take in parameters, although it doesn't have to. We can have functions without parameters, but a function can take in parameters. It then does something with those parameters, then returns a value, and that value can be used for something else. Perhaps it could be printed to the screen and displayed to the user, or perhaps it might be used as a parameter in a second function call.